It started with a box. Simple, unassuming, and wrapped in brown paper that bore no return address. Alyssa, a 24-year-old graduate student studying folklore, was used to odd deliveries. After all, her burgeoning reputation as a collector of obscure artifacts often drew the attention of people looking to unload their strange, unwanted items. But there was something about this particular package that set her on edge. The moment she brought it into her apartment, a faint, cloying scent of lavender and decay seemed to seep through the tape. Setting it on her kitchen table, she studied the box, her fingers hesitating as they hovered over the flap. Alyssa was no stranger to the macabre. Her shelves were lined with dusty tomes about haunted places and cursed relics. But something about this felt personal, invasive even. Finally, she tore the tape and opened the box. Inside, nestled in layers of yellowed tissue paper, was a doll. It was no larger than a loaf of bread, its porcelain face cracked in several places. Glass eyes, faded to a pale gray, stared lifelessly forward. The doll wore a tattered Victorian gown, the lace yellowed with age, and its dark, wiry hair looked as though it had been crudely sewn back onto its scalp. Alyssa felt a shiver creep up her spine. "Who's," muttered under her breath. A folded note at the bottom of the box caught her eye. It was handwritten in a looping, spidery script. "To whoever receives this, beware. She sees you now. Do not anger her. Do not leave her alone." Alyssa scoffed, though the unease lingered. She set the doll on a side table, half expecting it to topple over. It didn't. Its tiny feet seemed to grip the surface unnaturally well. Brushing off the sense of dread, she filed the doll away in her mind as another addition to her collection. That night, the air in her apartment felt heavier. The hum of the refrigerator seemed louder, the creaks in the floor sharper. As Alyssa prepared for bed, she swore she heard faint whispers. Soft, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere all at once. She shook her head. Long hours of research could do that to a person. At precisely 3 a.m., Alyssa awoke to the sound of something shattering. Heart pounding, she crept into the living room. The doll lay on the floor, several feet away from where she had placed it. A picture frame had fallen from the wall above the side table, its glass splintered across the hardwood floor. "You've got to be kidding me," she whispered, her voice trembling. As she knelt to pick up the doll, a sharp pain shot through her finger. She pulled her hand back to find a small cut, fresh blood welling from the wound. Looking down, she saw a single shard of glass embedded in the doll's cheek, as though it had been aiming for her. For the first time, Alyssa felt truly afraid. Alyssa didn't sleep the rest of the night. Every creak, every shadow seemed magnified in her mind, a growing symphony of paranoia. She placed the doll back on the side table, using an old scarf to avoid touching it directly. Her laptop was open on the couch, her fingers trembling over the keyboard as she typed. She combed through folklore forums, auction histories, and obscure collectors' blogs, hoping to find any mention of a cursed doll matching its description. Hours passed with little progress until a name caught her eye in the comments section of a particularly outdated post. Honora. The commenter had written, "If you find Honora, burn her. She won't stop watching until you do." Honora, Alyssa whispered, the name heavy in her mouth. Her unease deepened when she scrolled further and found a reply from the same user, warning others not to touch the doll without gloves. The message ended ominously. "If you've seen her, it's already too late." A knock on her door startled her, the sound echoing through her quiet apartment. Her heart raced as she glanced at the clock. 7 a.m. It was far too early for visitors. Tentatively, she approached the door and peered through the peephole. Her neighbor, Mrs. Delaney, stood outside, her expression unusually grim. "I heard something break last night," Mrs. Delaney said when Alyssa opened the door. "Are you all right, dear?" Alyssa hesitated. She didn't want to sound paranoid, but the weight of her fear made her spill the truth. "I got this doll yesterday. It's strange. I think it moved on its own." Mrs. Delaney's face blanched, her weathered hand clutching the doorframe for support. "Did you say a doll?" Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Get rid of it. Now." "What?" Alyssa asked, her unease mounting. "There was a family here before you," Mrs. Delaney continued, her gaze darting nervously down the hall. "They had a girl, Sophie. She was obsessed with a doll like that. One day they were all gone, just vanished. The landlord said they moved out, but... She trailed off, shaking her head. There were rumors, whispers about that doll. Alyssa tried to laugh it off, but the tremor in her voice betrayed her. It's just an old toy. I don't believe in curses. You should, Mrs. Delaney said sharply. You don't know what it's capable of. She turned and hurried back to her apartment, leaving Alyssa alone with her thoughts, and the growing certainty that the doll was more than just an artifact. By evening, the whispers had returned. This time, they were louder, clearer. Alyssa? The voice was soft, almost gentle, but hearing her name spoken in an empty apartment made her blood run cold. She turned toward the side table where the doll sat, its cracked porcelain face glinting faintly in the dim light. I'm not afraid of you, Alyssa said aloud, her voice trembling. You're just a doll. You don't scare me. As if in response, the doll's glass eyes seemed to catch a flicker of light that wasn't there before. The air grew colder, the temperature in the room plummeting so quickly that her breath turned visible. Suddenly, the doll toppled forward on its own, landing face down with a soft thud. The note she'd found in the box reappeared, now lying beside the doll. But the words had changed. Written in the same spidery script were 3 new words: you were warned. The days that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and escalating terror. Alyssa tried to carry on with her research, telling herself the doll was just an object, a physical thing that couldn't truly hurt her. But her resolve crumbled each night as the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They no longer stopped when the sun rose. Instead, they seemed to seep into her waking hours, echoing in her mind even as she walked through the crowded streets of her neighborhood. Desperate for answers, she contacted the only person she thought might help, Dr. Margaret Chen, a professor specializing in cursed artifacts and occult history. Dr. Chen had a reputation for being no-nonsense, skeptical, but thorough in her investigations. Alyssa sent her an email with pictures of the doll and a description of the events, and within an hour she received a reply. Bring it to my office, immediately. The university campus felt eerily deserted as Alyssa walked toward the history department, clutching the doll in a padded bag. Every step felt heavier, as if the air around her resisted her movement. By the time she reached Dr. Chen's office, she was shaking. Dr. Chen greeted her with a stern expression, her sharp eyes immediately scanning the bag. Let me see it. Alyssa hesitated but finally unzipped the bag. The doll seemed smaller now, almost childlike, its cracked face peeking out from the folds of the padding. Dr. Chen's brow furrowed as she carefully lifted it, wearing gloves to avoid direct contact. This is worse than I thought, Dr. Chen said, her voice low. Where did you get this? It just showed up, Alyssa replied. No return address, no name, just that note. Dr. Chen shook her head, her jaw tightening. This isn't just any cursed object, it's a vessel. Dolls like this were often used in rituals to contain spirits, usually angry or vengeful ones. Whoever sent this to you knew exactly what they were doing. What do I do? Alyssa asked, panic creeping into her voice. Dr. Chen studied the doll for a moment before replying. There's a ritual, a way to sever the connection, but it's dangerous. If the spirit is as strong as I suspect, it won't go quietly. The professor handed Alyssa a list of items: candles, salt, a mirror, and a specific type of incense. Meet me at my home tonight, she said. We'll perform the ritual together. That evening, Alyssa arrived at Dr. Chen's secluded house, the doll once again in tow. The atmosphere inside was tense, the air thick with the scent of burning herbs. Dr. Chen had already prepared a circle of protection, lined with salt and candles. In the center stood a large antique mirror, its surface slightly tarnished. This mirror will act as a conduit, Dr. Chen explained. If we do this correctly, the spirit will be trapped inside and we can destroy it. But you must stay inside the circle no matter what happens. Do you understand? Alyssa nodded, though her stomach churned with dread. She placed the doll in the center of the circle as instructed, its lifeless eyes staring up at her. As Dr. Chen began chanting in a language Alyssa didn't recognize, the room grew colder. The candles flickered violently, their flames stretching and twisting as if trying to escape. A low, guttural growl filled the air, reverberating through the walls. Suddenly, the doll's head jerked to the side, its movements sharp and unnatural. Alyssa gasped, her instinct to flee warring with her promise to stay inside the circle. Focus, Dr. Chen shouted. her voice cutting through the chaos. "Do not leave the circle." The mirror's surface began to ripple like water, its reflection distorting. The growling turned into a high-pitched scream, and the doll's limbs twitched, its cracked face contorting into something almost human. Then, everything stopped. For a moment, the room was silent, save for Alyssa's ragged breathing. The doll lay motionless, its glass eyes dull and lifeless once more. But the mirror was different. Its surface no longer reflected the room but showed something else, an endless black void. Dr. Chen stood, her face pale but resolute. "It's done," she said. "The spirit is contained, but this mirror..." She trailed off, her gaze fixed on the void. "We must destroy it." Alyssa nodded, relief flooding her body. But as they prepared to move the mirror, a single word echoed through the room, chilling her to the bone. "Not yet." Alyssa froze, the echo of the words lingering in the air like a sinister whisper. Dr. Chen turned sharply toward the mirror, her face taut with fear. The surface, which moments ago showed a dark void, now shimmered faintly, as if something beneath its surface was stirring. "Stay back," Dr. Chen commanded, stepping closer to the mirror. She grabbed a heavy iron mallet from the table. "Iron disrupts spiritual energy. If we're quick, we can." Before she could finish, a sharp, cracking sound split the air. A spiderweb of fractures spread across the mirror's surface, glowing faintly with an unnatural, sickly green light. Alyssa stumbled backward as the mirror pulsed, sending a wave of cold energy rippling through the room. The doll began to move. Its tiny porcelain hands twitched, and its head slowly turned to face Alyssa. "You let her out," it said in a voice that was both childlike and ancient, echoing with layers of malice. Dr. Chen didn't hesitate. She raised the mallet and swung it toward the mirror, but the energy pulsing from it seemed to push back, throwing her across the room. She hit the wall with a sickening thud, slumping to the floor, unconscious. Alyssa was alone with the doll and the mirror, both now radiating an otherworldly presence. The whispers she had endured for days grew into a cacophony of voices, all speaking over one another, their words unintelligible but filled with rage. "No," Alyssa muttered, her eyes darting between Dr. Chen's motionless form and the doll. "This isn't happening. This can't be happening." The doll began to rise, levitating off the ground. Its cracked face seemed to shift, the fractures widening to reveal darkness beneath. "You brought me here," it hissed. "Now you will pay." Desperation surged through Alyssa. Her eyes fell on the bag of salt near the ritual circle. Without thinking, she lunged for it, spilling the contents around herself in a haphazard line. The voices seemed to falter, their volume decreasing slightly as the salt formed a crude barrier. The doll paused, hovering just outside the circle. Its glass eyes narrowed, as if calculating its next move. "You think that will save you?" it sneered. Alyssa's mind raced. She remembered Dr. Chen's words. The mirror is the conduit. Destroy it, and the connection is severed. But with Dr. Chen unconscious and the mirror fighting back, she had no idea how to proceed. Her gaze landed on the candles still flickering at the edge of the circle. Fire. It was her only chance. Alyssa grabbed one of the candles and, summoning every ounce of courage she had left, hurled it at the mirror. The flame hit the surface, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then, the room erupted in chaos. The mirror shattered with a deafening roar, releasing a blinding burst of light. The doll let out an ear-piercing scream as it fell to the ground, its porcelain body shattering into countless pieces. The light faded, leaving the room in darkness. The oppressive cold was gone, replaced by an almost suffocating silence. Alyssa crawled to Dr. Chen's side, shaking her awake. Dr. Chen groaned, blinking groggily. "Did you destroy it?" "Yes," Alyssa whispered, her voice trembling. "It's over." But as she helped Dr. Chen to her feet, her eyes fell on one of the shattered pieces of the doll. A faint green glow pulsed from within the fragment, almost like a heartbeat. Dr. Chen followed her gaze, her expression hardening. "It's not over," she said. "Not yet." They both knew what this meant. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. The spirit might have been contained, but its essence lingered, waiting for another chance to emerge. And somewhere, in the shadows of the room, a faint, childlike giggle echoed, sending chills down Alyssa's spine. The house loomed over the hill like a sentinel of forgotten times. Vera, a historian with a penchant for uncovering mysteries, arrived late that evening, her car headlights slicing through the dense fog. The estate, known locally as Hollow Ridge, had been abandoned for decades, its last occupants gone under circumstances no one dared to discuss openly. Vera wasn't interested in gossip. She was drawn by the rumors of a vast collection of antique dolls locked in the attic. Some called them cursed, but she dismissed such notions as fanciful folklore. As she pushed open the wrought iron gates, a chill ran down her spine. The property was vast and unkempt, weeds reclaiming cobblestone paths. A weathered oak tree stood at the center of the courtyard, its gnarled branches scratching against the sky. Her heels clicked on the uneven stones as she approached the entrance. It took considerable effort to open the heavy wooden door, and it groaned in protest, releasing a gust of stale, cold air. Inside, the house smelled of mildew and neglect. Dust coated every surface, and cobwebs draped the corners like sinister curtains. Vera switched on her flashlight, the beam catching fragments of a life left behind. An overturned chair, a shattered mirror, and a faded portrait of a family whose faces seemed to watch her every move. No turning back now, she whispered to herself, clutching her satchel tighter. Her first stop was the library. It was surprisingly well preserved, its shelves groaning under the weight of leather-bound books. Vera scanned the spines, her fingers trailing over embossed titles. Most were ordinary volumes, but one stood out, a diary, bound in crimson leather. She opened it cautiously, finding entries written in an elegant but hurried script. The entries spoke of the dolls, how they were acquired from all corners of the globe, how each one seemed to carry an air of malice, and how the family had begun hearing whispers in the night. Vera's curiosity deepened. She decided to spend her first night cataloging the diary's contents, seated at an ornate desk beneath the library's stained glass window. The moonlight streaming through painted the room in eerie hues of red and green. As the hours passed, the silence grew oppressive. She heard faint sounds, wood creaking, the soft patter of something scuttling across the floor. "It's just the house settling," she muttered, though her pulse quickened. At midnight, her flashlight flickered and died. Vera cursed under her breath, fumbling for her spare batteries. That's when she heard it, the faint sound of laughter, high-pitched and childlike. It echoed through the halls, sending shivers down her spine. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. The laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by a profound silence. Summoning her courage, Vera followed the sound to a narrow staircase at the end of the hall. The steps spiraled upward, their edges worn smooth by time. She climbed slowly, each creak of the wood amplifying her dread. At the top, she found a door slightly ajar, revealing the attic. It was filled with shadows and the faint scent of lavender. As she stepped inside, her flashlight flickered back to life, illuminating rows upon rows of dolls, each one staring at her with unblinking eyes. Vera's breath caught as the beam of her flashlight swept over the attic. The dolls were everywhere. Shelves lined the walls, and antique trunks overflowed with porcelain faces and painted eyes. Some were pristine, their delicate features preserved as if untouched by time. Others were cracked and faded, their once bright dresses now tatters of silk and lace. They all seemed to be staring at her, their expressions frozen in eerie silence. She approached cautiously, the floorboards groaning beneath her feet. "Just antiques," she murmured, more to herself than anything else. Yet the air in the attic felt different, heavier, almost oppressive. The dolls seemed to radiate a strange energy, as if they were waiting for something. Vera shook off the unease and began her work, taking out a notebook and camera to document the collection. As she clicked her first photo, a soft rustling sound broke the silence. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The sound came from one of the shelves, where a particularly ornate doll sat in a miniature rocking chair. Its glassy eyes seemed to meet hers. "It's just a mouse," she reasoned aloud, though the explanation felt hollow. She turned back to her work, but her hands trembled as she scribbled notes about the doll's detailed craftsmanship. A lace bonnet, tiny leather boots, and a face painted with an unsettlingly lifelike expression. Then came the whisper. It was faint, barely more than a breath, but unmistakable. "Why are you here?" Vera whipped around, her flashlight darting across the room. No one was there. She laughed nervously, shaking her head. "I must be hearing things," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. The dolls, however, seemed to have shifted subtly, their positions different from when she had first entered. The diary she had been reading earlier weighed heavily in her thoughts. One passage had mentioned that the dolls were never to be moved, yet here they were, as if defying that command. Vera's logical mind rebelled against the absurdity of the situation, but her gut screamed for her to leave. Still, curiosity kept her rooted in place. She decided to examine the rocking chair doll more closely. She lifted it carefully, noting its surprising weight. Beneath the doll's base was a piece of parchment, brittle with age. The faded script was in a language she couldn't decipher, but one word stood out: beware. Her skin prickled as the room seemed to grow colder. Suddenly, the rocking chair moved on its own, its gentle creak breaking the tense silence. Vera stumbled back, dropping the doll. It hit the floor with a sound that was far too loud, like a thunderclap in the stillness. The attic door slammed shut behind her, and the flashlight flickered again, plunging her into semi-darkness. Panic surged as she rushed to the door, yanking at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The whispering started anew, this time louder, overlapping voices filling the room. "Leave, you shouldn't be here. They're watching." Terror gripped her as she turned back to the dolls. Their faces seemed to twist in the dim light, their smiles becoming sinister. The whispers grew into a cacophony, and Vera dropped to her knees, covering her ears. The last thing she saw before the flashlight went out completely was the rocking chair doll, now sitting upright, its head tilted as if in mockery. The whispers stopped as suddenly as they had begun, plunging the attic into a suffocating silence. Vera stayed frozen, her back pressed against the door, heart hammering in her chest. The air felt thick, as if the room itself were alive and breathing around her. She fumbled for her phone, desperate to use its flashlight, but the screen refused to light. Even technology seemed powerless in this cursed space. She forced herself to focus, to think. "This is just a trick of the mind," she whispered shakily. "It has to be." Summoning her courage, she stood and swept her hand along the wall, searching for a light switch. Instead, her fingers grazed something cold and smooth, glass. She yanked her hand back, her skin crawling. Turning, she realized she was face to face with another doll, this one perched on the edge of a shelf, its blank eyes almost glowing in the dim light. "You have to stop this," Vera muttered, though she wasn't sure who she was talking to, herself, the dolls, or something unseen. Her mind flashed back to the diary. The last entries had grown increasingly frantic, detailing how the family had tried to rid themselves of the dolls. They'd burned some, buried others, but no matter what they did, the whispers always returned. Worse still, strange accidents began to occur. Falls from the stairs, inexplicable fires, and finally, the disappearance of their youngest child. Vera's thoughts were interrupted by a loud crash. A trunk in the corner had tipped over, spilling its contents across the floor. Among the clutter was a large, ornate doll, its porcelain face cracked, revealing what looked like something organic beneath, a texture that resembled flesh. Vera's stomach turned, but before she could examine it further, a chilling voice broke the silence. "You can't escape us." She spun around, her breath hitching. The voice hadn't come from the attic. It had come from inside her head, a rasping, guttural whisper that seemed to burrow into her very thoughts. Her vision blurred, and for a moment, she thought she saw the dolls moving. Not subtly this time, but crawling, shifting toward her with unnatural speed. She stumbled back, her foot catching on a loose floorboard. She fell hard, pain shooting through her arm. When she looked up, the rocking chair doll was directly in front of her, its tiny hand outstretched as if reaching for her. A scream tore from her throat as she scrambled to her feet, kicking the doll aside. Its head snapped backward with a sickening crack, but then slowly realigned itself, its painted lips curling into a smile. Desperate, Vera yanked open her satchel and pulled out the diary. Flipping to the final pages, she found a cryptic passage. "The curse can only be broken by returning them to their maker, but beware. She watches still." Beneath the passage was a sketch of an old woman, her face obscured by a veil, and an address scrawled in hurried script. Vera had no idea if the address was still valid or if this maker even existed, but it was her only chance. Clutching the diary, she bolted for the door. This time, it opened with a violent force, sending her stumbling into the hallway. She didn't stop to question her luck. Racing down the stairs, she heard the whispers chasing her, growing louder and more frantic. As she reached the front door, the doll's laughter echoed through the house, high-pitched and mocking. Outside, the cold night air hit her like a slap. She didn't stop running until she reached her car. Fumbling with her keys, she finally managed to start the engine and sped down the winding road, the estate's shadow vanishing in the rearview mirror. But as she drove, the whispers lingered, faint but persistent, as if the dolls weren't finished with her yet. Vera drove through the night, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly, her knuckles turned white. The address from the diary was scribbled hastily on a notepad beside her, illuminated by the faint glow of her car's dashboard. It led to a remote village deep in the countryside, miles away from the nearest town. The road was dark and narrow, bordered by dense woods that seemed to press closer with every mile. Her thoughts raced as she pieced together the fragments of the diary. The dolls were cursed, that much was clear, but why? And who was the maker? The old woman's sketch haunted her, the veiled face etched into her mind. A deep sense of foreboding settled over her as the car's GPS signaled her destination ahead. The house came into view suddenly, a ramshackle cottage at the end of a dirt path. It was ancient, its thatched roof sagging and windows clouded with grime. A single light flickered inside. Vera hesitated, gripping the diary like a talisman. She considered turning back, but the whispers in her head had grown louder during the drive, an incessant hum that seemed to mock her fear. She had no choice. The door creaked open before she could knock, revealing a stooped figure, cloaked in shadows. "You've brought them back," the woman said, her voice rasping like dry leaves. Vera froze, unsure whether to speak or run. The woman stepped into the dim light of a lantern, her veil obscuring her features. "Come in," she beckoned, her gnarled hand pointing to the doorway. Vera entered cautiously, the air inside heavy with the scent of herbs and smoke. The walls were lined with shelves holding jars of strange substances, bones, dried flowers, and what looked disturbingly like small animal parts. The woman gestured for Vera to sit at a wooden table, its surface scarred and stained. "You've been cursed by them, haven't you?" the woman asked, her voice carrying an eerie calm. Vera nodded, placing the diary on the table. "I found these dolls in an estate," she began, her voice trembling. They're alive, aren't they?" The woman chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Alive? No. There's something far worse. They are vessels, each one housing a fragment of a soul. My soul." Vera's blood ran cold as the woman lifted her veil, revealing a face ravaged by time and pain. Her eyes were hollow, her skin pale and cracked like porcelain. "I was a doll maker once," the woman continued, "renowned for my creations. People came from across the world to buy them. But my success came at a cost. I made a pact, a promise to give my creations a piece of myself, so they would be unmatched in their beauty and lifelikeness. But the magic twisted them, turning them into harbingers of misfortune." Vera stared in disbelief. "Why didn't you stop?" The woman's expression darkened. "Because I couldn't. The pact bound me. The dolls took more and more of me until there was almost nothing left. Now they are all that remain of my soul, scattered and vengeful." "What do I do?" Vera asked desperately. The woman placed a gnarled hand over the diary. "The answer lies in destruction, but it's not simple. You must burn them with their maker, me. Only then will the curse be lifted. But beware, they will fight you to the end." Before Vera could respond, a loud crash erupted from outside. She turned to see dolls flooding through the door, their glass eyes gleaming with malice. The woman grabbed a pouch of herbs from the shelf, chanting in a language Vera didn't understand. The dolls faltered for a moment, but then surged forward, their tiny hands reaching. "Go," the woman shouted. "Take the lantern and burn them. Burn it all." Vera didn't hesitate. She grabbed the lantern and threw it at the nearest shelf, the flames catching instantly. The dolls screeched, their voices blending into an unholy wail. The old woman stood resolutely in the center of the chaos, her chant growing louder as the flames consumed her and the dolls alike. Vera stumbled out of the house, coughing as smoke filled her lungs. She watched from a safe distance as the cottage collapsed in a fiery blaze, the screams of the dolls fading into silence. The whispers in her head ceased, leaving only an eerie calm. For the first time in what felt like days, Vera felt the weight lift from her shoulders. But as she turned to leave, she spotted something on the ground. A single doll, untouched by the fire, its glassy eyes fixed on her. Its lips curled into a smile. The doll sat in its glass case, untouched for decades, its painted face frozen in a placid, unsettling smile. The case was tucked away in the corner of a small-town antique shop, where mismatched furniture and forgotten relics gathered dust. It was a peculiar shop, one that seemed to swallow sound, the faint tick of a clock, the only indication of time's passage. Evelyn Turner, a young journalist with an insatiable curiosity for the macabre, stepped inside, drawn by an unshakable pull. Her assignment was simple: research local legends and write a piece about the most haunted items in town. Yet, as she approached the doll's case, her breath hitched. Something about its glassy eyes, deep and unnervingly lifelike, made her stomach churn. A small plaque at the base of the case read, "Miriam, 1903, beware her gaze." "Careful with that one," an elderly voice croaked from behind the counter. Evelyn turned to see a frail woman hunched over, her hands gnarled like old tree roots. "People say she watches you when you're not looking." Evelyn chuckled nervously, brushing a strand of her dark hair behind her ear. "Clever marketing. Does it work?" The old woman's gaze darkened. "It's no gimmick, dear. That doll has brought nothing but misery. I keep her locked up for a reason. She's not for sale." But Evelyn was already hooked. She leaned in closer, her reflection merging with the dolls in the glass. "What's her story?" The woman hesitated, her fingers twitching against the counter. "Miriam belonged to a little girl who lived in that big, empty house on Oak Street, the one with the overgrown garden. They said she loved the doll so much she wouldn't let it go, not even in death." Evelyn felt a chill crawl up her spine. And, the woman continued, her voice a whisper now, "those who've tried to take Miriam, they've regretted it. She doesn't like being taken from her home." Evelyn's pulse quickened. It was exactly the kind of story her editor would love. She glanced back at the doll, its expression almost smug. Something about it unnerved her, but also intrigued her. She made up her mind. "I'll just take a few pictures for my article," she said, pulling out her phone. As the flash went off, the old woman flinched. "Don't," she warned, her voice sharp. "You'll stir her up." Evelyn ignored her, snapping photo after photo. But as she reviewed the images, her stomach dropped. In each one, the doll's eyes seemed to shift, its gaze boring straight into the lens. Evelyn swallowed hard, brushing it off as a trick of the light. "Thank you for your time," she muttered, backing toward the door. The old woman's words followed her like a curse. "You should have left her alone." Outside, the air felt heavier, the streets quieter. Evelyn shook off her unease and headed back to her car. Yet, as she drove away, she couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror. For just a moment, she thought she saw a small figure sitting in her back seat, its eyes glinting in the dim light. Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. By the time she arrived at her small apartment, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting the city in shades of deep blue and gray. She hurried up the steps, her heart pounding for reasons she couldn't explain. The photos she had taken burned a hole in her mind, and she needed to examine them more closely. Setting her bag on the kitchen counter, she plugged her phone into her laptop. The images loaded one by one, each more unnerving than the last. At first, the changes in the doll's eyes seemed subtle, a shift in angle, a faint gleam that wasn't present before. But as she scrolled further, her blood ran cold. In the final photo, the doll wasn't sitting in its glass case anymore. Instead, it stood upright, its tiny hand pressed against the inside of the glass, its painted mouth twisted into a faint smirk. Evelyn blinked hard, her breath catching in her throat. It had to be a prank, maybe some strange reflection or an odd trick of the camera. Determined to prove herself wrong, she called up the antique shop. The phone rang endlessly before the same elderly voice answered, this time sounding even wearier. "It's Evelyn," she said quickly. I need to ask you something about Miriam." The woman sighed heavily. "You didn't listen, did you? What did you do?" Evelyn hesitated, her fingers gripping the phone tightly. I just took some pictures. But something's wrong with them. The doll, it looks like it moved. Of course, she moved, the woman snapped, her voice trembling. She doesn't like to be disturbed. You should delete those pictures. Right now. I can't. Evelyn started to argue, but the line went dead. Frustration and fear battled within her as she stared at her phone. Against her better judgment, she decided to dig deeper. Later that night, Evelyn found herself surrounded by books and articles about haunted dolls, each tale eerily similar to her own. Dolls that moved on their own, whispered secrets, or brought ruin to their owners. But one story caught her attention, a 1920s newspaper clipping about a young girl named Clara who had died mysteriously in her home on Oak Street. The only detail repeated across sources was that she had been holding a doll when they found her. Clara, Evelyn murmured, her fingers hovering over the doll's photo on her laptop. A sudden noise shattered the silence. It was faint at first, a delicate tapping like fingernails against glass. Her heart seized. The sound came again, this time louder, more insistent. It was coming from the living room. Evelyn rose slowly, her legs trembling as she crept toward the source of the noise. The tapping grew louder, rhythmic, deliberate. Her breath caught when she saw the source, the glass cabinet holding her grandmother's china. The tapping stopped the moment she stepped into the room. For a moment, all she could hear was her own breathing. Then she saw it, a faint, child-sized handprint smeared on the inside of the glass. Her vision blurred as fear surged through her. "This isn't real," she whispered. But the room seemed to disagree. Her laptop screen flickered from the kitchen, drawing her attention back. When she turned to look, her heart plummeted. The doll was on her screen again, but this time its position had changed. It now stood in the center of an unfamiliar room, its porcelain arm outstretched as though pointing at something just out of frame. Evelyn slammed the laptop shut and paced the room, her mind racing. Every instinct screamed at her to get rid of the photos, to delete every trace of Miriam. But as she reached for her laptop again, a single thought froze her in place. What if deleting the photos only made it worse? Evelyn's fingers hovered over the keyboard, her breath shallow as she debated whether to delete the images. Her rational mind wrestled with her gut instinct, but something primal told her the doll wasn't just a harmless artifact. Her laptop buzzed softly, a notification from the photo editing software she hadn't opened. The images auto-loaded, and as each one appeared, the room seemed to grow colder. She couldn't ignore it anymore. In every frame, the doll was closer. Its delicate porcelain feet edged toward the foreground, and its painted features grew sharper with each photo. Evelyn felt bile rise in her throat as she opened the last picture. The doll stood just inches from the camera, its tiny hand reaching outward. It felt too personal, like it was reaching for her. "No," she whispered, slamming the laptop shut again. But the tapping resumed, this time louder. It wasn't just glass anymore. The sound was everywhere. Walls, windows, even the floor beneath her feet. Evelyn grabbed her phone, her trembling fingers dialing the antique shop's number. The old woman answered almost immediately, as though she'd been waiting. "She's with you, isn't she?" the woman asked. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of dread. "I don't know what's happening," Evelyn stammered. "The photos, she's moving in them." And now, the tapping. The woman inhaled sharply, and for a long moment, there was only silence. Then she spoke, her tone grave. "You have to take her back. She doesn't belong to you, and she knows it." "Take her back?" Evelyn echoed, her voice rising. "I didn't take her. She's still in the shop." "Are you sure about that?" Evelyn froze. Slowly, she turned to the living room, her eyes scanning every corner. Her gaze fell on the glass cabinet again. The tiny handprint was still there, but something else caught her attention. A faint shadow, low and small, seemed to linger just behind the cabinet door. "No," she said aloud, backing away. "No, no, no." Her phone buzzed against her ear, startling her. She had forgotten the old woman was still on the line. "Listen carefully," the woman said, her voice urgent now. "If she's in your house, you can't let her stay. You have until dawn to return her to the shop. After that—" "What happens after that?" Evelyn demanded. The old woman hesitated, then muttered, "She chooses." The line went dead. Evelyn's heart thundered as she stared at the blank screen. She didn't need to be told twice. Grabbing her car keys and a flashlight, she stepped toward the door. But as her hand touched the doorknob, she heard it. A soft giggle, high-pitched and childlike, coming from behind her. She spun around, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The sound of tiny footsteps echoed through the room, darting from one shadow to the next. Her hands shook as she shined the light toward the cabinet. It was empty now, the handprint smeared as though something, or someone, had climbed out. Evelyn bolted for the door, throwing it open and racing to her car. The air outside was suffocatingly still, the kind of silence that pressed down on her like a physical weight. She didn't look back as she started the engine, her trembling hands gripping the steering wheel. The antique shop wasn't far, but every minute on the road felt like an eternity. Shadows seemed to flicker in her peripheral vision, and the air inside the car grew colder with each passing mile. The giggle came again, this time from the passenger seat. Evelyn didn't dare look. "Almost there," she whispered to herself, her voice cracking. As she approached the shop, she saw the faint glow of its lights, a beacon in the oppressive darkness. She skidded to a stop in front of the building, stumbling out of the car and toward the door. But as she reached for the handle, she froze. Through the glass, she could see the doll. It was back in its case, its face tilted upward in an expression that could only be described as triumphant. Evelyn stood frozen, her eyes locked on the doll through the antique shop's glass door. How had it returned before her? Her mind raced, trying to piece together the impossible. The faint glow of the shop's lights illuminated Miriam's porcelain face, which now seemed more vivid, almost lifelike. Her painted lips curved into a faint smile that sent a shiver down Evelyn's spine. The door creaked as it opened, startling Evelyn. The old woman from before appeared in the doorway, her face pale and shadowed in the dim light. "I told you not to disturb her," she said, her voice barely audible. "Now you've brought her back with something worse attached." "I didn't bring her here," Evelyn stammered. "I swear, I don't even know what's happening." The old woman's sharp eyes bore into hers. "She chose you the moment you took those pictures. That's how she connects. You gave her a way out, and now she's made sure you'll never forget her." Evelyn's stomach churned. "What do you mean, a way out? She's back in the case." The old woman stepped aside, gesturing for Evelyn to enter. "You'd better come in. There's no turning back now." Reluctantly, Evelyn stepped into the shop. The air was thick and musty, tinged with the scent of aged wood and decay. Miriam sat in her glass case, eerily still, yet Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that the doll was watching her every move. "Why does she choose people?" Evelyn asked, her voice trembling. The old woman sighed, pulling a faded photograph from a drawer. It showed a young girl with curly hair clutching Miriam tightly to her chest. Her name was Clara, the woman explained. She was an only child, loved by everyone who met her. But when her parents bought her that doll, things changed. She became possessive, obsessed. By the time anyone realized how dangerous Miriam was, it was too late. "What happened to her?" Evelyn whispered, already fearing the answer. The woman hesitated before continuing. "Clara was found in her bedroom one morning, clutching Miriam. No one knows exactly how she died, but her face..." The old woman trailed off, shaking her head. It was twisted in a look of pure terror, and from that day on, the doll was cursed. Evelyn's knees felt weak. Why not destroy it? Why keep it here? The old woman's expression hardened. "You think we haven't tried? Miriam doesn't burn, she doesn't break. Every time someone tries to get rid of her, she finds her way back. All we can do is contain her and hope no one else stirs her up." Evelyn's chest tightened. "But I've already stirred her up, haven't I?" The old woman nodded grimly. "She's bound to you now. Until someone else takes her, you'll never be free of her. And even then..." Her voice trailed off, the unspoken consequences hanging heavy in the air. Evelyn's mind reeled. She couldn't live with this. She wouldn't. What if I bring her back to where she came from? To the house on Oak Street? The woman's eyes widened. "You'd be playing with fire. That house is just as cursed as she is." But she hesitated, then sighed. "It might work if you're willing to risk it." Evelyn didn't hesitate. "I'll do it. I can't live like this." The old woman reached into a cabinet and pulled out a rusty key. "The house has been abandoned for years. This will get you inside, but be warned, whatever happens in that house is beyond my control." Once you step through that door, you're on your own." Evelyn took the key with trembling hands. Her gaze flickered to Miriam, who seemed to be smiling wider now, as though amused by the plan. As Evelyn turned to leave, the old woman called after her, "You have until sunrise. If you're not out by then..." "What happens?" Evelyn asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The old woman's expression was unreadable. "You won't come out at all." The house on Oak Street loomed in the moonlight, its sagging roof and broken windows giving it the appearance of a creature lying in wait. Overgrown vines tangled around the porch, and the front gate hung askew, creaking faintly in the cold wind. Evelyn gripped the rusty key tightly, her knuckles white as she approached the entrance. The weight of Miriam's glass case in her other hand was almost unbearable, though the doll inside seemed unnervingly light. The moment Evelyn stepped onto the porch, the air changed. It grew colder, sharper, as if the house itself was alive and aware of her presence. She glanced at Miriam, her tiny face still frozen in that unsettling smile. For a brief moment, Evelyn thought she saw the doll's head tilt ever so slightly. "Stop it," she muttered to herself, forcing her shaking hands to unlock the door. The old wooden frame groaned as it swung inward, revealing a darkness so thick it seemed to swallow her flashlight's beam. Steeling herself, Evelyn stepped inside. The air was heavy with dust and decay, and the faint scent of mildew clung to her skin. The house was eerily silent, save for the distant creak of the floorboards beneath her feet. She placed the glass case on a table near the entryway and carefully opened it, lifting Miriam out with trembling hands. "Okay," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "This is where you belong. You can stay here now." As soon as the doll touched the table, a sudden gust of wind slammed the door shut behind her. Evelyn jumped, her flashlight flickering wildly. She spun around, but the hallway was empty. The temperature plummeted further, her breath visible in the icy air. The giggle came again, echoing through the empty halls. Evelyn's stomach churned as she shone the flashlight toward the sound. The beam landed on a doorway at the end of the hall, slightly ajar. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. "This isn't real." But her legs moved on their own, carrying her toward the doorway. The floor creaked beneath her weight, each step amplifying the oppressive silence. When she reached the door, she hesitated, her hand trembling on the doorknob. The room beyond was Clara's bedroom. The faded wallpaper was adorned with childish drawings of flowers and stars, but the furniture was coated in a thick layer of dust. In the center of the room stood a small wooden bed, its covers undisturbed, as though Clara had just stepped away. Evelyn's flashlight flickered again, and she caught a glimpse of something on the bed, a shape, small and still. She stepped closer, her heart hammering in her chest. Miriam sat in the center of the bed now, her glassy eyes fixed on Evelyn. "How?" Evelyn's voice broke. She had left the doll in the other room. The temperature dropped again, and the door slammed shut behind her. Evelyn spun around, fumbling for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. A faint whisper drifted through the air, growing louder with each passing second. "Clara." The voice was childlike, but warped, echoing unnaturally through the room. Evelyn pressed herself against the door, her flashlight shaking in her hands. The whispers grew into a cacophony, overlapping voices calling Clara's name. And then she saw her. A faint figure materialized near the bed, a little girl with curly hair and wide, empty eyes. Her dress was tattered, her skin pale and translucent. She stared at Evelyn, her expression unreadable. "Why did you bring her back?" the girl asked, her voice sharp and accusing. I just wanted to..." Evelyn stammered, unable to form a coherent thought. "You shouldn't have come here," the girl interrupted, her gaze darkening. "She doesn't belong to me anymore. She belongs to you." The whispers surged, filling Evelyn's head with unbearable noise. The walls seemed to close in, and the room spun around her. The girl vanished, leaving only Miriam on the bed, her smile now impossibly wide. Evelyn screamed, grabbing the doll and hurling it across the room. It hit the wall with a sickening crack, but when she looked again, it was back on the bed, unharmed. "Please," Evelyn sobbed, falling to her knees. "What do you want from me?" The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a deafening silence. The doll tilted its head, its glassy eyes locked on Evelyn. "You?" a voice said, soft and cold. The room plunged into darkness, and the last thing Evelyn saw was Miriam's porcelain face, impossibly close, before everything went black. When the sun rose the next morning, the house on Oak Street stood as silent and lifeless as ever. The neighbors claimed they heard screams in the night, but no one dared investigate. Inside, the glass case was back in its corner, untouched. Miriam sat within it, her painted smile as serene as ever. And in the faint reflection of the glass, if one looked closely, they might see a shadow. A young woman, her face frozen in an expression of terror, forever watching from the other side.